Let us spend some time with today's Gospel from St. Matthew, chapter 5, verses 43 to 48, and also with today's feast, St. Alban, the first martyr of England. Today's Gospel can be approached in terms of reconnecting with the very source of human identity, love itself. It helps us to understand distortions and perversions of this love and law, and also to find motivation to reconnect with this very source. This is the closing part of Jesus' comment on the second part of the table of the commandments. The Pharisees and the scribes mutilated the original commandment. They didn't quote in full the passage from Leviticus Book 19, chapter 19, verse 18, that love your enemies as thyself, love your neighbor as yourself. In the interpretation of the law, they somehow shifted the emphasis on then who is our neighbor. And when they made the distinction between personal enemy and a neighbor and an indifferent neighbor, they limited the word so that those not included in neighbor were not to be loved but hated. However, Jesus teaches us that love, the full quotation of the Old Testament, love should be our moral imperative, including everyone. Our vision of the other person should be shaped by love. And this is what we could call the positivity of the Gospels. And I think we are encouraged to read all about Jesus' public ministry in terms of understanding his positive attitude to life, his grounding mission in the Father's love. He comes to heal, but he comes to heal with his joy and love. Or in Jungian terms, we could say that love is forgotten. The full meaning of love is forgotten. This forgotten love, to love your neighbor as yourself, this love can be seen as our collective unconscious, buried in us, as an archetype, to use his terminology. The archetype of love, this unconditional love, drawn from God's own unconditional love, is indeed an archetype, an archetypal energy as it were, the vivifying energy of the individual soul and our collective soul. We are severed from this love. Jesus wants us to reconnect with this very heart of our existence. Otherwise, we live with the perversion of this universal law of love in us. And we can make a reference to our wars and hatred to which we are giving in and following. That's also a kind of extension of this perversion, and added what we do in practice when we ignore the full meaning of Leviticus chapter 19 verse 18. The Pharisees, just as our culture subscribes to this interpretation, to this mutilated interpretation, hate thine enemy, hate your personal enemy. However, in the original spirit of the Old Testament, according to Leviticus, we are to love our neighbor as ourselves instead of taking vengeance, bearing a grudge. Jesus extracted this conclusion. So this is not a new commandment, but the old commandment, the archetype of love, as it were, brought forth again. I say to you, and then Jesus emphasizes our changed attitude about the love of enemies, how to respond. Ego, in the Greek word, I am saying to you. As God's own Son, Jesus crushes the perversions of the law. Jesus reconnects us with our true center, our ability to love the enemies. And here we can really reflect on what's going on in our world in terms of wars, particularly the war in Ukraine, or the war propaganda on both sides. Biblical revelation and Jesus cuts the story short. We are interpreting the law of humanity in a perverted way, making a clear distinction between us and our personal enemies. Instead, he says, the Gospel is using the word agapete, love constantly. Love your enemies, those who are personal enemies, who are persecuting you, hating and trying to do you injury. And this love is not naive. As we can see, it x-rays and unmasks our motivation in history. We are not fighting wars to do justice. We are extending our own interests, acquitting ourselves, making a reference like the Pharisees to divine law, but we don't quote the full revelation, because loving your enemy, not becoming like them, not responding like them, is the categorical imperative of our lives. And here where we can connect all we have just said with today's feast of Saint Alban. This young man, a pagan young man, welcomed a praying Christian priest to his house. He overlooked how the man was praying fervently and love, and he just saw how his prayers and how his meekness and love were really powerful, gave a huge impression on him. And he became like him. He decided to be a Christian, to the extent when the soldiers came to arrest his guest, who escaped with his help, they arrested him instead, because he became a Christian and he never denied his faith. In a sense, we could say that Saint Alban reconnected with this deep center of us, with love, unconditional love, drawn from God's unconditional love. In Jungian terms, he reconnected with this unconscious, with this vivifying energy, the archetype of meaningful life, of all life at all. And just to pursue a little bit this Jungian approach, that Jung's model is very interesting because he informs us that our personality has two centers, the ego, our rational mind, and a deeper center, what he calls the self, which contains the archetypes, which can respond to the archetype of love, and all these life-giving images of love. Though not mixing Jung with the Gospel, but it's a really useful, I found it a really useful analogy, that when we reconnect with our true center and realize that not the ego, not our ego is in control, but this far wider circle of love and divine energies, then we feel tremendous joy. And when we think back of the first centuries, the persecution of the martyrs, where did they get the strength to resist the temptation of offering incense at the altar of the age, at the altar of Caesar? This powerful joy, which was generated in them by finding their God at the very core of their existence and life, it simply transformed their life. It made their identity flourishing in full joy, like in a big celebration. And this explains their inner strength to witness to Christ. But on the other hand, this explains our own joy and strength, why we love Jesus, why we like living where we are in our families and working on our relationships, personal in the families and in our workplaces. Because we have this reconnection, this axis between our previous ego, rational mind, and our deeper heart. And just as a conclusion, love your enemies. If a person or a culture is unable to reconnect with this deep ground of human identity, then the person or culture becomes ill and psychologically, spiritually traumatized. And we can imagine the difference between the acts of one who is rooted in this commandment, love your neighbor as yourself, and the acts of a culture which is totally disconnected from its truer self. That explains wars, divisions, and the zero desire to reach peace.